Funding for Market Journal is provided by the Nebraska Corn Board.
Growing more with less is the mantra of Nebraska's corn farmers, and they're using incredible technology to do it. Soil moisture monitors let them know when their crop needs water and how much. GPS systems eliminate overlaps in the field, saving fuel and money. New hybrids reduce the use of pesticides and increase yields. When you're talking new technology and innovation, Nebraska corn farmers are all ears. Nebraska's family corn farmers, sustaining innovation.
Market Journal, television for agricultural business decisions, is a presentation of the University of Nebraska-Lincoln's Institute of Agriculture and Natural Resources. Promotional support is provided by the Nebraska Farmer Magazine, and major funding for Market Journal is provided by the Nebraska Corn Board.
Welcome to this week's edition of Market Journal. I'm Jeff Wilkerson. On this episode, we report from the 2015 Nebraska Power Farming Show at the Lancaster Event Center in Lincoln, where Nick Mueller analyzes the USDA's December crop report. Brad Lubben discusses property tax reform in Nebraska. Derrel Martin talks about groundwater level changes in the state, and Paul Jasa explains how farmers can begin using cover crops. Nick Mueller from Stewart-Peterson is our corn and soybean market analyst this week. The USDA's December crop report, released Wednesday, was fairly mild. The agency made no changes to ending stocks in soybeans and wheat, but it did raise corn ending stocks 25 million bushels. The agency also projected a 50 million bushel reduction in corn exports and a 25 million bushel increase in corn for ethanol use. We talked with Nick here Thursday afternoon and began by asking for his thoughts on the USDA's latest estimates.
Supply and demand numbers, as usual, were pretty neutral for December. We lowered exports by 50 million bushels. We probably need to take another 50 million off eventually, but we upped the crush by 25 for ethanol, and we'll probably see it up another 25 when all is said and done.
All right, tell me about where we're seeing price movements this week. It was frustrating because it felt like we had momentum going to close out last week, and this week, especially beans took a huge hit. Where was the weakness coming from?
Yeah, the bean chart started looking really positive from a technical standpoint. You had the MACDs flipping bullish. We were pushing up into the Bollinger Bands, and those were starting to turn up. We closed above the 100-day moving average. And producers did what they should be doing. They started to sell, and then that means the commercial turns around and hedges that. And then once there was any weakness in the market and that support line started getting taken out, I think anyone who made profit being long on that run took their profits before Wednesday's supply-demand report.
We also saw some weakness in the overall stock market, crude oil especially falling to multi-year lows. Do you think crude oil, as low as it is, has a big impact on either corn or soybean markets?
I think all markets in general, yeah. I mean, the low prices at the pump, don't help corn prices. Crude broke some pretty major support. It's going to be a really interesting market. I think it will stabilize. I don't think crude stays down here long term by any means, but how low it can go, that's a good question.
Is it a threat to profitability for ethanol at all?
Absolutely.
How big of a threat?
I guess it would depend how long it would stay down here. I don't expect it to stay down here that long, so I don't think long term it has a major effect. I think crude's much happier in the $40 to $60 range than down at these pretty unbelievable levels.
What's your forecast for production down in South America this year?
Right now, everything looks pretty good. Things can change. We're still in a growing season, but right now I would say it looks like they're going to have a big crop. On the export side of things, they're going to export just as much as us this year, so that has an impact. They have as much impact on world price as we do for the first time in a long time.
Why has Brazil become so competitive in that export market?
The strong dollar is definitely a factor there, as well as infrastructure's gotten a lot better. So, all those factor in. They're a more reliable exporter than they've ever been.
Argentina's new president took office today. Do you think that long-term this could shift how Argentina is a player in either corn or soybeans?
Absolutely. I think we see the export tax come off the grains right away. I would expect the export tax for beans to be lowered by about 5%. And then the big question, I think our bean prices I don't think we see January breaking 865 unless they decide to devalue the peso right away. I don't expect that to happen. I think it will be incremental, so we should see support with beans right now. If they would do that, which I'm not expecting, though, I mean, we'd be down at $8 in a hurry.
Can you explain kind of what role that plays, why it would have such a big impact?
Well, it would make us even less competitive on the world market, and they would be very competitive on the world market, and it would just shift even demand further away from us.
What are your cash targets right now for trying to sell some corn or soybeans?
Corn and soybeans, I like selling anywhere in the upper level of these ranges if you're looking to move it before the first of the year. I think we might get some strength into the first of the year. Right now, when you look at the index funds, they don't have a very long position. That becomes an opportunity to the upside. You look at managed money, they're net short corn and beans. That becomes opportunity to the upside. I don't see them wanting to carry a heavy net short into the beginning of our growing season. So I'm hoping we see some strength into the end of the year, into January. I think new crop corn will have the opportunity to be pricing between $4.20 and $4.40. And given the fundamentals, I think that's a price that needs to be defended. And I'm hoping we get there by January sometime, because if South American weather stays like it is, they're going to be coming on board in March, and it's a futures market. They'll be looking at it by early February.
And in soybeans for the futures market?
925 to 975. I know that it's a pretty big range. But given the fundamentals, if we get those opportunities, I think we need to defend those prices.
We know the U.S. right now is in a historically strong El Nino. If that would flip, or just tell me how, for the forecasting of prices, how that's impacting what you believe will happen next.
Yeah, what I've been talking to my clients now, when we look at where the market is, we're at pretty low prices. The volatility's come out of options, especially call options. And now's not the time to be buying puts. I'm not interested in adding to my hedges at this point for 16. And given how strong the El Nino is, if it flips to a La Nina, we could see a really strong one there as well, and could look at, possibly a 25% drop in production. It's all going to depend on when it flips. If it flips in August, it's not going to harm us at all. If it flips in June, we're going to be at $5 corn in a hurry. So I look at 450 calls. They're 15 cents or under at this point. That seems like a cheap investment that will allow me in the future to be aggressively forward contracting or hedging 420 to 440 corn, knowing if we get into a weather market, all those bushels are already covered up.
Next week, Todd Holtman from DTN will join us to look at corn and soybean markets. Nebraska irrigates more acres of farmland than any other state in the nation. In fact, 5 states, Nebraska, California, Texas, Arkansas, and Idaho, account for more than half of the total irrigated acreage in the U.S. California, however, used the most water according to 2010 data. It withdrew 20% of the country's total. At this week's Power Farming Show, Nebraska Extension's Derrel Martin presented a seminar on water consumption in Nebraska. We talked with him here and began by asking how groundwater levels had changed in Nebraska over the last 60 years.
There was a study that was done by the USGS to look at kind of on a statewide volume balance that's of water stored in the groundwater in Nebraska. And what they found, first of all, is about 2/3 of all the water that's in the Ocala aquifers underneath Nebraska. That volume of water is equal to about half the volume of water of Lake Michigan. But what they found when they compared the levels in 2011 to those in 1950 is that for Nebraska, the volume of water in storage had only changed about 1%. Other states like Kansas and Texas had seen major reductions of water in storage. Now, that doesn't mean we don't have distribution problems and groundwater declines in some areas of the state. We certainly do. But in other areas, we've had water levels that have risen because we've diverted water from the streams. So right now in Nebraska, the balance, we're about where we started.
Why is this so different? Nebraska, Kansas, Texas, South Dakota has done well. Why are Nebraska and South Dakota so different?
Well, the main reason there would be that we do have this surface water supply. But when I irrigate, the water I use that I pump from my groundwater or from the stream, it has to either come from groundwater or from the stream. So we've developed a lot of irrigated land, and so if our water table hasn't dropped much, then that water has mostly come probably from what would have been stream flow.
Can you tell me where water goes or how we consume it when we use it for irrigation?
Well, let's think about the center pivot, because that's what we use on about 85% of our land. The water that we pump, first of all, it's put into the air, and it could drift or it could evaporate in the air. A lot of people think that's a big number, but it's actually pretty small. Some water evaporates off the crop. And then a lot of it is, what we mean by consumed is water that's used by the crop as evapotranspiration. So the liquid water we pump, that's converted to water vapor as it evaporates or transpires from the field. You know, that number is by far the biggest part of what we pump with modern systems. It could be 75, 80% of the water that we pump is actually going back into the atmosphere. Some of the water might run off the field, some might also deep percolate in some locations. But yeah, about 75, 80% with a good pivot is being used by the crop.
As you think about the future of water, Derrel, how do we enhance sustainability in the state?
Well, okay, sustainability is really looking at the supply we have and the uses that we have in a watershed. And we shouldn't confuse that with efficiency. Efficiency is how much of the water I remove is actually used by the plant, and that has a lot more to do with productivity. The sustainability depends on how much water we use per unit area, and it depends on how much land area that we manage. So first and foremost, we have to get those water uses in balance and the acres in balance to be able to sustain that long-term supply. We may be able to do some things to convert water consumption that's not beneficial to those areas that's more beneficial.
Such as?
Well, getting rid of invasive species or phreatophyte water use maybe on crops where it doesn't mature very well. Maybe I could use that better on plants where it does, even from a dry land perspective. And then anything we can do to enhance the storage of water in the soil so that it doesn't evaporate in the spring. So residue cover on irrigated land is a good example that might improve.
Do you also feel that creating reservoirs and storing water and using it later could be beneficial?
Yeah, that'd be a practice we might call augmentation. And in that setting, yeah, what we try to do is take the water from the stream during periods of high flow, store it off stream, either in a reservoir or in groundwater, and then we let that water come back to the stream at a time that's more beneficial, either for the stream or for another purpose along the stream. Nebraska's done very little of that. Most of our neighbor states in the West have really used that augmentation scheme a lot. And so it's something I think Nebraska has to take a hard look at.
Is there anything now that you see that would threaten the way that Nebraska crop producers are able to irrigate their crops?
Oh, I don't see anything magic that's coming down the line. I do think we're going to have to deal with this question of sustainability long term. You know, what's driving irrigation water management, not only in Nebraska but at the western United States, is meeting our in-stream flow requirements. And those are either driven by interstate compacts or in our case also by endangered or threatened species. And so we don't have any choice but to meet those. And so we're going to have to adapt in order to meet those, and that's going to take a lot of different forms, I think. Reduce area in some case, maybe reduce how much I pump, maybe changing some crops, and then maybe being able to use the water that we do pump in a more productive way. So maybe the farmer, if they do have to make a change, maybe that economic impact won't be quite as big for them.
We recently looked at how Nebraska's Natural Resources Conservation Service was helping to manage this state's groundwater through the Ogallala Aquifer Initiative. You can see that interview with Craig Derrickson in the November 20th episode of Market Journal. As we've told you before, a 2013 report from UNL's Department of Agricultural Economics showed how property taxes had made Nebraska's ag sector the heavy lifter of local government services. From 2012 to 2013, ag land accounted for 87% of the state's total land valuation increase. Governor Pete Ricketts has said property tax reform is one of his top focus areas, but the Nebraska unicameral has been unable to enact significant legislation. The Omaha World Herald reported last week a legislative supercommittee recently ended months of study on the topic with no specific proposals for change. Earlier this week, we talked with Nebraska Extension Public Policy Specialist Brad Lubben and asked why property tax has been so difficult to reform.
It's interesting. You deal with property tax reform, and clearly the ag community is very aware of where property taxes have gone, more than doubled in the last 10 years in terms of the property taxes that ag is paying. But it's a difficult proposition to reform something that is such a fundamental part of financing local services, particularly schools. You've got schools that make up 60% of a property tax bill. So if you want to reform property taxes, you really end up reforming school funding as well.
How much do property taxes contribute to the overall pot?
Well, if schools are 60% of the property tax bill, and it turns out that property taxes are about 50% of total school funding, any formula, any policy choice to reform one is going to have to involve the other.
Tell me about the K through 12 money that it brings in, and kind of this discussion about if you touch one, you have to, talk about reforming the other.
Right. Well, fundamentally, if you talk about property tax reform, many of the components of the property tax bill for a producer really do rise and fall in value with the assessment. So there's at least sort of an equilibrium between demand for services and sort of cost to the taxpayer. But public schools are one of those challenging things where the costs of schools may not move very closely with the underlying value of property in the district. So the property tax bill and the demands on schools do not necessarily move together. It's that shock to the system, particularly here in the last decade as farmland values have gone substantially higher, assessed values have gone higher, and the amount of taxes that farmland is contributing to public funding for schools relative to the amount of taxes that non-farm property is contributing. Farmland's picked up a much bigger share. It's actually turned around the state formula such that instead of rural districts getting much of the state aid, it's now the urban districts that are getting much of the state aid, and the shift in aid is put even more pressure on local taxes.
What are the realistic options here to making some advancement in this area?
We've seen a number of proposals and a number of alternatives discussed, and certainly landowners, agricultural interests have been pushing for more effort. In the last legislative session, the primary reform came about in the sense of an increase to the property tax rebate. That's the line on your property tax bill that reduces the total amount owed. But there's lots of additional ideas, extremely challenging choices. Do you address assessment of farmland, either shifting the methodology for assessing to something a little more stable, farm income, earning potential instead of land values? Do you reduce the assessed valuation rate? That gives some short-term relief. It may not solve the finance issue. Fundamentally, this is about addressing the finance question. Do you readdress the school aid formula or the total amount of state aid to schools? If so, where do you find the funds to do so? And then you also have to fight, or at least balance that with other demands on state dollars and sources of dollars. So lots of battles ahead.
Right. In that you mentioned one of these things, if you take it away from property taxes, certainly it's got to come from somewhere else, right?
It has to come from somewhere. If it seems that the only way to sort of reform property taxes is to find additional aid elsewhere, then you're going to have to find work on sales tax or income tax that helps more closely match needs with sources. It's an extremely difficult challenge, and fundamentally one of the challenges is a basic economic concept. Are you trying to maximize the output given some fixed budget, or are you trying to minimize the cost given some fixed output? Are we trying to, is there an acceptable level of sort of school output, graduation rates, state performance on state tests, etc.? Is there an acceptable level of output and we can economize on how we deliver it? We could look at alternatives that might be more efficient delivery mechanisms. Or is it about we have a funding base, we use as much of that funding base as we can, and we provide as many opportunities as we can with that base? In this whole formula, it's not just about property tax reform and the amount of school aid and the sources of funds. It's fundamentally about local districts that also make choices about what kind of school system do we have. That makes it complicated.
Towards the end of the month, we'll look ahead at the 2016 Nebraska legislative session with Nebraska Extension Ag Law Specialist Dave Aiken. The December Nebraska Farmer says Dawes County farmer Marcus Kane never owned a patent on the farm equipment he designed, built, and tested more than 70 years ago, but his innovations may have influenced farm machinery manufacturers for decades. Now a group of supporters are teaming up to donate the equipment to the Dawes County Historical Society Museum in Chadron. To learn about Kane's unique and innovative creations, you can check out the December Nebraska Farmer. One of the other presenters at this year's Power Farming Show was Nebraska Extension's Paul Jasa. Paul discussed the use of cover crops as part of a cropping rotation. We talked with Paul here and started by asking about producers' interest in using cover crops.
Cover crops used to be out there all the time when every farmer had a little bit of livestock. Every farmer needed to grow a little bit of feed for the livestock or a little bit of nitrogen for his own crop. In fact, our grandparents, probably for almost any farmer in the state, was an organic producer growing some nitrogen. Now we're figuring out we can do that with cover crops as well.
What are the common questions that producers have when they think about using or starting to use cover crops?
Well, usually I get the phone call that says, what should I plant for a cover crop? I point blank ask them, what are you trying to do with the cover crop? And that you have to know. If I'm trying to grow some nitrogen, I'm going to plant a legume. If I'm trying to reduce erosion, I'm going to plant a grass, fast-growing grass in particular. If I'm trying to anchor the soil, I'm going to do something with a fibrous root system. So again, you need to know what they're trying to accomplish before you make a recommendation.
Can you explain more on how cover crops could help you manage nitrogen?
Well, cover crops, they're sort of two-edged when it comes to nitrogen management. The first off is that we have a lot of our producers out there who put on a little bit more nitrogen than they should. And we get some excessive rain, some excessive irrigation, we leach some of that nitrate down in the groundwater. Well, I can use a cover crop after my cash crop to become a nutrient capture device, sort of grow the nitrogen from the soil into a biomass form. So I can store my nitrogen, get it released next year when that residue breaks down. The other side is I can plant a cover crop like a legume to actually make some nitrogen and purchase less fertilizer. And again, that's what Grandpa did because he didn't have fertilizer to buy.
What role does water play, or what role do cover crops play in either depleting or helping to save water?
Well, it depends a little bit on where we're at. If we're back east, out in the central corn belt, we got excess water, I'm going to grow cover crop to grow the water out rather than lose the water to, say, tile drainage or surface drainage. If I'm out west, I might grow a cover. It sounds odd. Yes, it's going to use some water, but it's going to keep the sun and wind off the soil surface to reduce evaporation. A bare soil has a lot more evaporation than any farmer's ever thought about, and keeping the sun and wind off makes a big difference. Now the danger is if I'm going to plant the cover in the fall, I'm making a guess. Next spring, is it going to be wet or dry, hot or cold? I'm not sure. It makes it a little harder to guess.
What are the challenges in planting and then killing off the cover crop?
The planting comes down to a little bit, what is your cash crop you're following? If it's something like wheat or corn silage, I've got a lot longer season to grow. I got more selection of crops I can plant. If it's corn or soybeans and it's a delayed harvest like some of our friends had this year, then you got a lot shorter list of things you can choose from. But the difference is too, as well as, are they going to overwinter? Is the frost going to kill it? Is the winter going to kill it? Or is it going to become growing next spring? I love cover crops if the winter kills it for me. But next spring, again, I trust the 30-day forecast perhaps. If it's going to be wet, let the cover crop grow and use the water. If it's dry, go ahead and kill it early so it doesn't use too much water.
I assume the overarching question here is, do cover crops pay?
In the short term, I doubt it'll show up in the balance sheet that it pays. In the long term, it's going to build a healthier soil, more resilient soil that's going to pay in the future. And I sort of ask farmers, I say, how many of you guys change oil in your tractor? That doesn't pay. It costs you money, but it makes the tractor last longer. How many build terraces on land? That doesn't pay. It costs money, but land lasts longer. I think cover crops and soil life is going to be about the same way. We're going to invest some now to build for the future.
Now, with this week's weather forecast, here's Nebraska Extension State Climatologist Al Dutcher.
Well, folks, here again for the weekly forecast. Of course, during this last week, we've seen some very nice temperatures move in across the state. Last week, we indicated that we were going to, the models were pointing out to some 50s and 60-degree weather in a few isolated spots of southwest Nebraska. Well, we ended up hitting the 70-degree mark, so the models underplayed the amount of warmth. And although they underplayed it, I don't think any of us are going to complain about that type of temperatures at this point in the early part of the winter. Now, as we go forward in time, we got a couple systems to deal with, one that's moving through the state as we speak and expected to create some problems to the east of us, less so in our region, and then we need to turn our attention to another system coming in during the middle of next week that has the potential to lay down a foundation of accumulating snowfall, and just a matter of where the track lays out, which will determine who gets the heaviest amount of snow as the system cranks its way through the central United States. So let's take a look at the upper models. First thing I'll draw your attention to is the current system that's impacting us has a deep trough dug in all the way down into southern New Mexico in the upper atmosphere, and a lot of energy moving northward. So in front of it, there's going to be a lot of moisture coming up from the surface to feed this system, and basically the track of the system is going to determine who gets the snow and who gets the heavier precipitation. And right now, the heaviest precipitation is being laid out from basically northeastern Texas northward up through central Iowa, where we could see up to 2 to 3 inches of moisture with this system during the heavy rainfall. But as you move toward the west, the precipitation drops off dramatically, and the heaviest precipitation lays across southeast Nebraska, primarily in the form of rain. As this system cranks itself out overnight into tomorrow, we start to see most of the main energy to the south of us and really bringing the fetching moisture up through the eastern corn belt. And for Nebraska, we'll be on the backside of this upper air low, so we do have the chance to see some snowfall occur during the early morning hours, but it does not appear that it'll be significant at this time. We're looking at maybe an inch. In a few spots, may see a couple inches, but outside of that, the heavy precipitation stays to our east. And then we do a clearing trend as we get into Monday, as we see a ridge building back in temporarily, and yet another system building in the west. And this one's the one that we need to pay attention to because the models are all over the place. Right now, they're keeping the storm track just to the north of Nebraska, at least to the main foundation, but any southward movement of this trough, and we could see some rather significant snowfall across the state. So by the time we get to Tuesday, this trough is digging once again. We get this big shot of energy ejecting out of this trough that is going to lay a foundation of snow on the backside of the surface low over the Dakotas, some of that touching northern Nebraska. We could be looking at a couple inches of accumulation, much more significant if the system once again stays a little bit farther south. On Wednesday, the system weakens and pulls out toward the Great Lakes. We leave a little bit of energy in our region for some flurry activity, but that's about the extent of it. And then we look for a clearing trend as we get through Thursday, as ridge starts to build in. That will lay some flurry activity across the western part of the state, but for the most part, looks like fairly dry conditions. And then we'll be under the influence of high pressure on Friday. So if we look at the temperature forecast, we are looking at a gradual cool down as the week progresses. We work more Arctic air into our region, snow this weekend with a little bit of rain, and then we're looking at another snow event as we get into Tuesday. The 8 to 14-day forecast from next Thursday to the following Tuesday shows once again more storm activity in the western United States, and some of that energy will start to move out, especially as we get close to Christmas.
Thanks, Al. Today's interviews can be found individually on the Market Journal website and through the Market Journal mobile app. They include information on the USDA's December crop report, groundwater level changes in the state, property tax reform, and cover crops. As always, you can keep up with Market Journal during the week by following us on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter. Next week, Todd Holtman will be our corn and soybean market analyst, and Stephen Benzinger will describe the outlook for Nebraska's winter wheat crop. Until then, thanks for watching. I'm Jeff Wilkerson. We'll see you next week.
Join Market Journal online at marketjournal.unl.edu. You can also follow us on Twitter, Instagram, and Facebook. Promotional support is provided by the Nebraska Farmer Magazine, and major funding for Market Journal is provided by the Nebraska Corn Board. Market Journal is produced by the University of Nebraska-Lincoln's Institute of Agriculture and Natural Resources.